Nephilim post flood had to either exist because um, the flood was localized and not worldwide, or the fact that the sons of God could have gone into human women more than once. So we're going to talk about that. But this theory to me doesn't really work, not in my opinion, because if God flooded, the what they consider to be the earth at the time, uh, because of what happened with the sons of God and human women having relations and having, offspring, then if it happened more than once, then you would think that God would, he maybe not by water, but some other type of punishment that God would inflict, to try and wipe that out. But you don't see that through the Old Testament. Um, so now let's go to this next section, and it's dealing with the Transjordan, so the area on east of the Jordan River, like right before they went into Canaan. And so we're going to talk about basically two pieces here, and use this to kind of set up the framework for the conquest of Canaan. Like, why is it that God gave them this mandate to go in and dispossess the people of the land? And there was a lot of people who died, a lot of people who were who were killed because of the conquest. And I mean, it's a lot. And it's a very complicated story when you really look at it, because it's like, hey, why did it have to be this way? Why can't it be a different way? But we have to always think back to how they saw the world in their time. So we're going to talk about that. And in saying that, we're going to talk about the iniquity of the Amorites and the place of the serpent. So it's two different kings that Israel faced and defeated in that Transjordan area. So they had to clear it out. So let's talk about that. So the things that happened with Sihon and Og, Sihon happened to be an Amorite king, and Og was literally, according to scripture, a giant. So these things were like a preview of what had to happen when they go into Canaan, or when they went into Canaan. And it was this mindset of clearing out these descendants of Nephilim that kind of guided the logic as to how they would attack and Canaan and dispossess the people, and the instructions that they would receive, about Canaan. If you remember, we talked about how God told them, don't intermarry with them, don't serve their gods, don't commingle, because if you do, they're going to be a thorn in your side. And of course, Israel didn't listen, and the people were indeed a thorn in their side. But all this stuff was a preview. What we're going to talk about tonight, it was really a preview to what the author calls a holy war. All right, but it wasn't a holy war against necessarily human beings, even though there were human casualties, but it was a holy war against these divine beings or semi-divine beings who were living in Canaan, who were descendants of the Nephilim. So that's the framework, right? So everything is against that backdrop. All right. So the what we call the Transjordan is like the territory that's east of Canaan, right? And so God took them through a different route this time. In Numbers 13, he took them through the south, but when they got to the entrance, they were afraid to go in because they went and scouted the land out. I think they spent like 40 days in there spying out the land. And when they came back, they had this bad report, right? They told the people and told Moses, man, we can't do it. The people are too big. We saw giants everywhere. We can't do it. So they ended up wandering around the desert for 40 years, and then they come back. Now on the cusp of going back in, God takes them a different way. But with God taking them a different way, it was on purpose, because there were a lot of people living in a specific region. We're going to read about that in a second. Uh, who were descendants of Lot and Esau, right? And so that land belonged to them. So God brought them in a different way to keep them from having to fight through those people, right? And there were no giants in the land where they were passing through, because Lot and Esau's descendants cleared them out already. So turn to Deuteronomy chapter 2. Let's read verses 8 through 12. Deuteronomy 2, verses 8 through 12. To it right quick. All right, verse 8 says, so we passed on beyond our brothers, the sons of Esau, who live in Seir, away from the Araba road, away from Elath, and from Ezion Geber. And he says, and we turned and passed through by the way of the wilderness of Moab. Verse 9. Then the Lord said to me, do not harass Moab, nor provoke them to war, for I will not give you any of their land as a possession, because I've given it to Ar. I've given Ar to the sons of Lot as a possession. And then verse 10 is the key verse right here. It says that Emim lived there formerly, a people as great, numerous, and tall as the Anakim. So that right there is a clue that the people who lived there before Lot's descendants moved in were descendants of the Anakim, who were descendants of the Nephilim. So there's that bloodline of the Nephilim still being present there, but they're not there, right? When they passed through, the people who lived here, those who would be considered descendants of the Nephilim were already removed. All right, and it says in verse, go down to verse 10, verse 11. Like the Anakim, they are also regarded as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim. And then verse 12, the Horites formerly lived in Seir, but the sons of Esau dispossessed them and destroyed them from before them and settled in their place, just as Israel did to the land of their possession, which the Lord now gave them. And then let's go to verses 17 through 22. Verse 17, the Lord spoke to me saying, today you shall cross over Ar, the border of Moab. When you come to the opposite sons of Ammon, do not harass them, nor provoke them, for I will not give you any of their land of the sons of Ammon as a possession, because I've given it to the sons of Lot as a possession. So again, you see that Lot's descendants, Esau's descendants were already living in these places. And so God is telling them, when you pass through here, don't make war with them. Don't harass them. Don't provoke them. It says, verse 20, it is also regarded as the land of the Rephaim, for Rephaim formerly lived in it, but the Ammonites call them Zamzumi, a people as great and numerous and as tall as the Anakim. So the Emim and the Zamzumim, those are descendants of the Anakim or descendants of the Nephilim. It says, but the Lord destroyed them before them, and they dispossessed them and settled in their place. So the Transjordan, where they were coming, the entrance had already been cleared out, right, of these descendants of the Nephilim. But that connection is what's going to drive them in their the next phase of their journey, which is they're going to have to deal with these two kings that are here. All right. And again, it comes back to this supernatural worldview. So you heard, the mention of the Anakim, the mention of the Rephaim, which we're going to talk about later. And so all of that's connected to or descended from the Nephilim. And we see that in Numbers 13. Matter of fact, let's go to Numbers 13 right quick and refresh that. So Numbers 13, verse 13:32. Yeah, let's read 32 and 33. So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we've gone and spied out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size. It says there also we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, are part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, so we were in their sight. So that is what kept them from going into Canaan initially, was the sight of these giant clans that were descendants of the Nephilim. And so the way that their worldview was formed between the giants and between some of the work in the Old Testament being finished while they were in Babylonian exile, and Babylon being a place of rebellion. If you think back to what we talked about a while back, and when they were in Mesopotamia, that's the like the cradle of where they came from, right? Abraham, that's where he was called from. And so, but the Babylon was a place of rebellion, right? Because we know that that's where they tried to build the Tower of Babel, and that place was also where the sons of God ended up having relations with human women. So all of that is going on there. So it's really a place of great iniquity, right? And remember when they were writing about the Nephilim, even in Genesis 6, which is believed to have been finished while they were in Babylon, when they talk about giants, that's a derogatory term, right? It's used as a really like a way to castigate the Babylonians. And so all this is in play, and all of these ideas about giants and about uh having being these semi-divine beings and these all these other bloodlines being present, that's what frames their worldview. And that is what like kind of the guiding factor in how they would attack and conquer Canaan. So these are the things that are kind of these three things, right? The Nephilim, which were uh, in Genesis 6, those were the offspring of human and divine beings. And then the sons of God coming and doing what they did. And then this disinheritance, all of this plays into the worldview. And so now we see these giant clans encountered in Canaan. And so now God is telling Israel, here, you got to go into Canaan and you're going to dispossess them. First time they didn't do it. So they wandered for 40 years and now they're going back to conquer that land. And so one of the things that was guaranteed was that they were going to encounter the descendants of the Nephilim. That's what they saw. That's what they saw when they scouted it out, the land out the first time. And so those people were still there. The second thing is that they were going to encounter nations that were under the dominion of hostile gods because of the disinheritance. We talked about that in Deuteronomy 32. And then so what would end up happening and what would drive the conquest of Canaan is the extermination of the Nephilim. And this is what the author this is how he paints this picture, right? That the descendants of the Nephilim, anyone with that semi-divine bloodline or of that semi-divine bloodline will have to be eradicated. And that is really what stood in the way of them taking possession of Canaan. So that's the worldview, that's the mindset. And so the first encounter that they had was with the king of Heshbon. His name was Sihon. And this is where I talked about at the very beginning. One of the things that one of the subtitles was the iniquity of the Amorites. So Sihon was an Amorite king, and so when God sent them east of the Jordan, what he was really doing was sending them to deal with this last area that was under the dominion of descendants of the Nephilim. Right, that was the purpose of them going that way. So if you look at Deuteronomy 2 and verses 26 through 30, let's look at that. This is Moses. Actually, you know what? Let's go up to verse 24. It says, arise, set out, and pass through the valley of Arnon. And it says, look, I've given Sihon, the Amorite, king of Heshbon, and his land into your hand. Begin to take possession and contend with him in battle. Right? And it says, this day I will begin to put the dread and fear of you upon the peoples everywhere under the heavens, who when they hear the report of you will tremble and be in anguish because of you. Verse 26. So I sent messengers from the wilderness of Kedemoth to Sihon. This is Moses now. Moses is talking now. He says, I sent messengers from the wilderness of Kedemoth to Sihon, the king of Heshbon, with words of peace. Now, God just told him to go and take the land, but Moses is also following God's initial instructions like he gave them when they went through Moab and the other lands like that. Don't make war, don't, do whatever. But Moses sends words of peace. Verse 27, it says, let me pass through Let me pass through your land. I will travel only on the highway. I will not turn aside to the right or to the left. Verse 28, you will sell me food for money so that I may eat, and give me water for money so that I may drink. Only let me pass through on foot. Just as the sons of Esau who live in Seir and the Moabites who live in Ar did for me until I cross over the Jordan into the land which the Lord our God has given to us. So Moses has his eye on Canaan, and yet God is telling them that they're going to have to contend with Sihon. It says, verse 30. But Sihon, the king of Heshbon, was not willing for us to pass through his land, for the Lord your God hardened his heart, hardened his spirit, and made his heart obstinate in order to deliver him into your hand as he is today. All right, and it says, verse 31, the Lord said to me, see, I've begun to deliver Sihon and his land over to you. Begin to occupy, that you may possess the land. In verse 32, then Sihon and all his people came out to meet us in battle at Jahaz. And the Lord our God delivered him over to us, and we defeated him with his sons and all his people. So this is the first battle that they've had to fight before they go into Canaan. So again, this is like a preview, because what they know about Sihon is that he's an Amorite king. And when Moses says in verse 30 that God hardened his heart, that's intentional, right? It's intended to bring up visions of Pharaoh and how God hardened his heart in order to deliver him over to the Israelites, right? Not in battle, because they didn't have to fight Pharaoh in a war, but God kept hardening his heart to the point where Pharaoh eventually gave up. And even when he gave up, God still sent that last plague just to let him know who he was. But when we think about why Sihon and why he's here and how he's connected with the Nephilim, we have to go back to Genesis 15. We look at 15, Genesis 15. This is God was making a covenant with Abraham, and verses. This is a familiar passage too. We've seen this a lot. But God is making a promise to Abraham, covenant with him. And in verse 13, he says this. It says, God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in the land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. So he's prophesying Egyptian captivity to Abraham. He says, verse 14, but I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. Verse 15, as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. Verse 16, then in the fourth generation, they will return here. So keep in mind, when he's talking to Abraham, Abraham is actually living in Canaan at the time. So he says in the fourth generation, they're going to return here where you are right now, to Canaan. For the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. So how does this connect? How does this connect Sihon to the Nephilim? Well, he was an Amorite king. And when God is telling Abraham that the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete, when it's time for the Israelites to pass through this land, that was their time for judgment. So at that time, it was at that time in the fourth generation that their iniquity and the judgment for their iniquity had come due. Right. So the term Amorite sometimes is general, sometimes it's specific. Anytime you hear it though, it's indicative of an enemy of Israel. And so that term was used to remind the readers of what happened in Genesis 6 with the flood and what happened in Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel. So how does this connect Sihon with the Nephilim? There's a direct connection. If you look at the book of Amos, you got to dig for that one. It's a minor prophet. It's after the book of Joel, which is after the book of Daniel, Hosea, and then I can get to it. So Daniel, Hosea, Joel, and then Amos. Amos chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. So we're going to see that the Amorites, that connection is there's a direct connection between them and the Nephilim, or as descendants of Nephilim. Verse 9, yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them. Now look at the description of the Amorite. Though his height was like the height of cedars, so very tall. Maybe not as tall as a cedar tree, but that's again colorful language to kind of or using a little bit of hyperbole to exaggerate the fact that they were tall. And it says, and he was strong as the oaks, and I even destroyed his fruit above and his root below. Verse 10, it was I who brought you up from the land of Egypt. And it says, and I led you in the wilderness 40 years that you might take possession of the land of the Amorite. So when we hear that term, right, and Amos using the Exodus as a backdrop for this passage, then he's really tying in the Amorites with what happened during that 40-year sojourn and why that had to happen, right? Again, because in Numbers 13, when they were there first time to go and take possession of Canaan, they didn't do it. And so what this indicates is that the Amorites were tall and that they were strong, and that height, that unusual height, would connect them to the Nephilim in the mind of a reader who was reading this, at the time that it was written, right? Or who had heard it, because this wasn't necessarily written down when it was being spoken. It was written down later. But a reader or a listener who heard these prophecies from Amos, right? So this is, again, informing their worldview. If they know the Amorites are descendants of the Nephilim, and they have this supernatural origin, then that means that in Canaan, there are people there who are semi-divine, descendants of semi-divine, and that bloodline, again, that's standing in the way of them taking possession of Canaan. So the battle for Canaan is really going to be supernatural. It's going to be between Israel, who is, as Scripture says, God's own possession, his inheritance, and the other gods who raised up bloodlines like the Nephilim to oppose Yahweh and oppose his people. So Sihon was connected to the Nephilim because of the Amorite connection to the Nephilim, right? So he's connected in that sense, though. So he had to go, right? Because again, just like the flood was used to eradicate or wipe out some of the Nephilim, we know now that not necessarily all of them died off, or if they did, these other gods were raising up more of them. Had to, if one of the two, they either didn't all get wiped out, or there were multiple occurrences where these divine beings copulated with human women. But either way, this is an enemy, and that enemy was persistent, and it was there, and he was going to be there. So the battle for Canaan went from just being a natural battle where we just going in and taking stuff and looting and robbing and stealing and killing, to one of a supernatural nature where we're actually going in and cutting down God's enemies, right? And there's another king that they had to battle as well. His name was Og, and it's in Deuteronomy 3. Let's turn to that. Deuteronomy 3 and verses 1 through 11. Real quick. All right, it says, then we turned and went up the road to Bashan. So that word Bashan is important. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And it says and it says, Og, the king of Bashan, with all his people came out to meet us in battle at Edrei. That's another word that's important. And it says, but the Lord said to me, do not fear him, for I've delivered him and all his people and his land into your hand. And you shall do to him just as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon. So the Lord our God delivered Og, also king of Bashan, with all of his people into our hands, and we smote them until no survivor was left. We captured all his cities at the time. There was not a city which we did not take from them. 60 cities, all the region of Argob, the kingdom of Og in Bashan. And verse 5 says, all these were cities fortified with high walls, gates, and bars, besides a great many unwalled towns. We utterly destroyed them, as we did to Sihon, king of Heshbon, utterly destroying the men, women, and children of every city. But all the animals and the spoil of the cities we took as our booty. All right. Verse 8. Thus we took the land at that time from the hand of two kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan, from the valley of Arnon to Mount Hermon. That's another key right there, Mount Hermon. And it says the Sidonians call Hermon Sirion, and the Amorites call it Senir. All the cities of the plateau and all Gilead and all Bashan, as far as Salek and Edrei, cities of the kingdom of Og and Bashan. Verse 11, for only Og, king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. That's a very important passage, verse 11. Behold, his bedstead was an iron bedstead. In it, it is in Rabbah of the sons of Ammon. Its length was 9 cubits, and its width was 4 cubits by ordinary cubit. Right. So that last verse 11 is really important in the understanding of who Og was and how he's connected to the Nephilim. Because again, remember we said that the reason they went the way they went through the Transjordan to get to access Canaan this time, the way they went that way was so that they can wipe out these last two representatives of this Nephilim bloodline in that area. So it says, for only Og, king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bedstead was an iron bedstead. It's in Rabbah of the sons of Ammon. Its length was 9 cubits, and its width 4 cubits by ordinary cubit. So Og was actually a very large man. And he was an Amorite king. Again, that's that word again, Amorite. He ruled this region known as Bashan. And his bed was 9 cubits by 4 cubits, or if you convert that into feet, 1 cubit is 18 inches. So it's 13 and a half feet by 6 feet, right? But the connection there is that 9 cubits by 4 cubits are the same dimensions that are mentioned for this bed in Timananki. There's a ziggurat that's believed to be connected to the Tower of Babel. I'm gonna show it to you on the next slide. But the bed is the same size, or it's said to be the same size as the bed that was inside that ziggurat. So the way that the Babylonians, one of the things they built the bed for was for their god Marduk to have relations with a female goddess. And when they did that, it brought prosperity to the land. That's what they believed anyway. And this is the same ziggurat that's believed to be on the site where the Tower of Babel was built, right? So this links even Og to this polemic against Babylon, right? And it connects them to Marduk, and it connects them to all these sinister things. And this is a recreation of the ziggurat in Timananki. So there was a bed inside this ziggurat, a huge bed, and it was there for the sole purpose of what they believe their god to have relations with his female goddess, and bring prosperity to the land, right? So that 9 cubits by 4 cubits is intentional because it's a way to connect all to that. So let's talk more about that. Joshua talks about this conquest as well. So let's turn to Joshua 12, verses 4 and 5. Joshua 12, verses 4 and 5. Bible turn. Joshua 12, verses 4 and 5. I'm gonna go up to 2 because it kind of recounts what we just read in Deuteronomy. So Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon and ruled from Aurora, which is on the edge of the valley of the Arnon, both the middle of the valley and half of Gilead, even as far as the brook of Jabbok, the border of the sons of Ammon. And it says, and the Arabah, as far as the sea of the Chinneroth, towards the east, and as far as the sea of the Arabah, even the salt sea, even toward Beth Jeshimah, and on the south at the foot of the slopes of Pisgah. And it says in verse 4, and the territory of Og, king of Bashan, one of the remnants of the Rephaim who lived in Ashtaroth at Edrei. Verse 5, and ruled over Mount Hermon. So though again, those terms, Ashtaroth and Edrei, so his where Og lived, and then Mount Hermon, which is also an important term, at Saleka, and all the Bashan as far as the border of the Gerishites and the Maccathites, and half of Gilead as far as the border of Sihon, the king of Heshbon. So when it talks about Og and where he lived, like those terms actually matter. Again, so you see the term Ashtoreth, you see Edrei, you see Rephaim. So those terms actually go all the way back to that Ugaritic text that we talked about months ago from Babylon, from ancient, not Babylon, Mesopotamia. And so these words actually mean something. So he was the last of the Rephaim, so he had to go. But these are like dead warrior kings who inhabited the underworld, right? So that's a whole nother class of beings. And then Ashtoreth and Edrei, the location, was at in the Ugaritic text is written as Bathan, which is also translated as Bashan, which means the place of the serpent or the gates of hell. And so literally where he lives, the description is literally the gates of hell, right? And so when it says that it also connects him to Mount Hermon, because it says he lived at Ashtaroth and Edrei and ruled over Mount Hermon. So that Mount Hermon is believed to be the location in Genesis 6, where the sons of God descended to earth and made the decision to take human women as wives and have offspring with them. But this also points to something else, which we're going to see in the next section, which we'll talk about next week. So the word Hermon, it comes from the noun Hermon, or the verb karam, which both come from the same root. So I have it in parentheses, KHRM with no vowels, just the consonants. But that word karam literally means to exterminate or to devote to destruction. And so all these little clues are in here as to why this has to happen. And the reason it has to happen is because, again, there are offspring of divine beings living among humans, and they are able to proliferate, right? And so God is using Israel as the instrument of judgment to go in and clean that up. And so the idea is connected to these giants, right? And the giants who are in Canaan, who they saw in Numbers 13, who obviously didn't die off after 40 years when they would get ready to go in. And so they're still there and they have to be eradicated. And so all of the stuff that we talked about is all connected to them coming into Canaan and cleaning that up, getting rid of those descendants of the Nephilim that are still present. And so it's really interesting to think about that, because again, if we take scripture at face value and we see it for what it is, it's really not, it's more supernatural than it is physical. Because if those beings are indeed descendants of divine beings, then that same thing that happened when we think about the same thing that happened in Genesis 6 could continue to happen, right? And that was a crossing of the boundary that wasn't supposed to happen, and so that could continue to happen. So God is using this opportunity to not only keep His promise to Abraham and give the land of Canaan to his descendants, that fourth generation, but also to get rid of this scourge of these giant clans who were still prevalent in the lands.